right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight for the Politics of Critical Theory panel hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. Um, I'm Rosa, and again, I want to thank everyone here for being here and also our panelists. To begin this, I want to first introduce Platypus, who is hosting this panel. Um, this panel is hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society and especially by the New York chapters, located at Columbia University, the New School, NYU, and Hunter College. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006 and organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, the new, and the post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left through hosting the discussion on the left. And so I think we're good to start, and I'm gonna introduce our panelists. First, we have Jay Bernstein, who is the Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research and is the author of a number of books on art, ethics, and critical theory. We also have Aaron Haycutt, who is the former editor-in-chief of the Platypus Review. And lastly, but not least, we have Jonathon Catlin. He's a PhD student, he is a PhD candidate in modern European intellectual theory at Princeton University. He's writing a dissertation on the concept of catastrophe in 20th century German and Jewish thought, with a focus on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Before we head to our panelists' opening remarks, I would like to introduce the prompt of our panel. So in 2010, the New Left Review published a translated conversation between Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. In the course of their conversation, Adorno comments that he had always wanted to develop a theory that remains faithful to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, while keeping up with culture at its most advanced. Adorno, it seems, was a Leninist. As surprising as this evidence might have been to some, is it not more shocking that Adorno's politics and the politics of critical theory have remained taboo for so long? Was it really necessary to wait until Adorno and Horkheimer admitted their politics in print to understand that their primary preoccupation was with maintaining Marxism's relation to bourgeois critical philosophy, like Kant and Hegel? This panel proposes to state the question directly. How did the practice and theory of Marxism, from Marx and Lenin, make possible and necessary the politics of critical theory? Is the politics of critical theory necessary at all? And just to clarify the structure of the panel, we will start with each panelist having 10 minutes for their opening remarks. And following that, they will be able to respond to each other's remarks for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then we'll dedicate the rest of the panel for a Q&A with the audience. So now I will hand over to the first panelist. Please, Jay Bernstein.
Thank you. It's nice to be back at a live event, especially with friends. So let me begin with the manifesto, some remarks from it. On the 15th of March, Horkheimer and Adorno suggest, they say, we are heading toward a situation compared to which Nazism was a relatively modest affair. I think that remark is true. They say sometime later in their conversations that after making continual statements of the absence of the Communist Party as a paralyzing liability, Horkheimer states, this is the 30th of March at the end, the moment politics is less able to do the right thing than at any other time in history is also the moment politics is no longer of relevance. This is near the end of the manifesto. I think this statement is now false. I believe what they say on March 25th, namely that we are living in a moment of emergency, a moment of suppressed revolutionary transition to a post-liberal capitalist form of life. Roughly, this is my thesis, the ecological fabric that provides the necessary conditions for a social reproduction are becoming undone. Severe weather is becoming manifest everywhere, undermining the conditions for social reproduction generally. Second, there is growing inequality and growing social fragmentation. And third, increasingly the ideas of liberalism have lost their authority and are unable to generate a recuperative politics for the future. What the critical theory of Horkheimer and Adorno understood deeply is that, and I think this is what distinguishes critical theory, is that social domination was utterly bound up to the domination and destruction of the living environment. That they believe modernity tokened the death of living nature. First, and this is unlike traditional Marxism, and secondly, unlike traditional Marxism, they argued that this was bound up with the hegemony of instrumental reason over all other modes of reason and rationality. That is, they believed that modernity suffered from a rationality deficit, and indeed, Marx himself was a victim of that rationality flaw, his belief in the unfolding of history towards utopia. Enlightened capitalism is a constellation of science, technology, exchange value over use value, and instrumental conception of reason as dominant over all forms of political thought. It seems to me that Horkheimer and Adorno's critical theory requires two fundamental corrections in order to regenerate the revolutionary potential that they believed was essential to the project. First is the commitment that socialism is not a unity, rather socialism is a constellation. My second thesis is that the only true successor to the critical theory of Adorno and Horkheimer has been ecofeminism. That nothing one finds in Habermas or Honneth or even my dear friend Rahel Yegi comes anything near the Adorno-Horkheimer critical theory, but ecofeminism certainly does, especially in its account of primitive accumulation. Let me briefly, very briefly say what I mean by socialism as constellation, and then even more briefly say what I mean by thinking of ecofeminism as the only true successor to traditional critical theory, the only true revolutionary program. Because Adorno understands the logic of instrumental rationality as operating through a reiterative process of subsuming particulars under use, under concepts, under universals, subsuming use values under exchange values, subsuming plurality under unity, he sometimes calls instrumental reason identity thinking. In developing a critical strategy for the overcoming of instrumental reason and identity thinking, Adorno famously orients the conversation toward aesthetics. Now, the puzzle was, why on earth, if you're a Marxist, Do you want to spend so much time talking about art? And the answer was that he thought that sensuous particularity of individual artworks were exemplary of what it would be to take seriously the dependency of mind on object rather than reducing the object to mind. The following hypothesis seems worth considering. Adorno's failure, his bad utopianism, his starry-eyed hope in something like a Benjaminian Messiah, is because he too had a moment of identity thinking, that socialism is just one thing. He imagines that the revolution that would translate us into a new form of life would be a singular political social act through which concept and object, self and other would be reconciled. I quote, "Utopia would be above identity and above contradiction. It would be a togetherness of diversity. This is an elegant but utterly empty statement. In fact, Adorno imagines the other of identity thinking in identitarian terms. The idea of utopia thus becomes blocked on the thinking and possibility of revolution. The cognitive significance of Adorno's strategy, however, is important, namely to find a mechanism within thinking through which our dependency on the object could be acknowledged. Here's my hypothesis. We can achieve a passageway from aesthetics to social practice by overcoming the ultra-objective violence that is involved in capitalist subsumption. And we do this by inventing a diverse range of new practices that responds to the living environment. For example, energy policies that do not pollute the atmosphere, energy policies that do not produce earthquakes, as in Oklahoma, fishing policies and practices that do not deplete the ocean or so distort oceanic ecosystems as to lead to collapse, farming technologies, especially relating to the production of new genetic varieties, vegetables and grains, farming practices that do not exhaust the soil, etc., etc., etc. Socialism is not one thing. It's a series of interconnected practices through which we decommodify land and labor and take them out of their existing destruction by capitalism. Second thought. What ecofeminism shares with the tradition of Marxist social reproduction theory is a thesis that Marx did not think through thoroughly. Namely this, that capital does something worse than commodify land, labor, and money. The trilogy that Karl Polanyi makes famous. What could be worse than commodifying land, labor, and money is the following. Capitalism is the first social formation that creates a systematic rupture between production and reproduction, between production for profit, Marx's famous MCM prime formula, money buys, commodities to produce more money, and the conditions of social reproduction, sustaining the social and biologic conditions necessary for our life together. Living nature, women, slaves, colonial subjects, and lands and racial others, all, by the way, assumed to be closer to nature than to culture, are violently expropriated, not part of capital's profit making, but violently expropriated as a condition of capitalist production, the famous domestic labor argument. Okay, just a minute to go. The ecofeminist thesis is that primitive accumulation doesn't happen just once. Violent expropriation, it happens over and over again in the sphere of social reproduction. This makes, I want to argue, for more variegated politics than narrow class politics, right? Because it associates colonial history, racial histories, histories of expropriated lands, all as themselves another feature of capitalist domination. My sense is the following, and I'll end with this comment, that this gathering of the dominated is revolutionary and explosive. And the great puzzle, the puzzle we're here to discuss in a way, is the continuing passivity, the sense that there are no alternatives, the sense of powerlessness that exists. I've already given you a half a dozen alternatives essential to revolutionary transformation. Hence, there are alternatives. Further, unlike the moment that Horkheimer and Adorno are living in, we are in a revolutionary situation because of the imminent collapse of the natural, social, biological conditions necessary for social reproduction. Liberal capitalism has actually failed, has already failed. So the question is, how do we understand the absence of political revolutionary vehemence? Is it a remnant, a hangover from the period they were talking about when there really was not a revolutionary situation? Is it a memory of passivity? An unearned experience of powerlessness? Is it a traumatic repetition of past powerlessness? It was to address an epoch of paralysis and remind that epoch that the structure of liberal capitalism was going to generate a situation in which the Nazi Holocaust would seem mild in comparison. We are on that path. That is why they wrote their manifesto, and it is why we need another one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Almost exactly 1 year ago, fellow Platypus member Dwiman Tran and I pursued an interview with Marcuse's and Adorno's student, Angela Davis. In the interview, I asked her about the difference between the two men. She responded that Adorno was obsessed with the revolution that should have happened in 1917, but failed, and thought all intellectual energy should be devoted to understanding that failure. Marcuse, she said, recognized the necessity of participating in the radical movements of that era. Meanwhile, interest in Marcuse was growing on the avowed left, with Jacobin republishing his 1968 lecture about the protests and strikes in Paris, and several different leftist journals publishing articles about the professor. In one Jacobin article titled The Two Souls of Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, Jeremy Cohen and Benjamin Serby argue that Marcuse had two souls, quote, on the one hand, the critical and materialist, on the other, the moralistic and defeatist. Lauding the book for its, quote, materialist analyses of working class integration through consumerism, a rising standard of living, and the culture industry, which aim to explain capitalism's unexpected resilience and absorptive capacities, while criticizing it for its too soft treatment of, quote, cultural radicalism, new subjects of history, ultra-leftism, and for Marcuse's pessimistic judgment that he was not living in a revolutionary epoch. It seemed to me that today the Frankfurt School has been cleaved in half. There's the Frankfurt School that describes the world to us and shows us the materialist possibility for revolution, the one which people seem to favor. And there's the Frankfurt School that is eternally pessimistic and perhaps too idealist in its criticism of the left and obsession with the failures of the past. And who likes a grump? I already knew from my experience reading Adorno that what makes him so difficult to swallow is his constant criticism of the left, even in a heavy tome like Negative Dialectics, where Adorno seems to be taking aim at Heidegger and participating in the battles of academic philosophy. The point is to show how the counter-revolution in philosophy reveals negatively the failures of the left and points back to the failure of Marxism to change the world as it had promised. His writings on the culture industry and popular music are, as he notes in Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, part of a criticism of the musical youth movement and not simply the timeless cultural criticism they are often taken to be today. When I finally read One-Dimensional Man, I was struck by how the book was a reflection on defeat. When Marcuse writes about the appearance of capitalism in his time as a totality in which no revolution is possible or necessary, he is not describing some thing called capitalism that always works that way, but rather working through how the crisis of capitalism appears in the ideology and practices of society, and perhaps most importantly, of the left. The first example that came to my mind while reading was Ralph Miliband's book, The State in Capitalist Society, in which he argues that the events of the early 20th century prove that revolution is neither possible nor necessary, nor perhaps even desirable. Certainly, the imagination that was so current on the New Left that the proletariat of the advanced capitalist countries could not make the revolution, or that revolutionary politics needed to take a back seat to preventing nuclear disaster or climate disaster, or that these disasters would make the revolution without a subjective act, were symptoms of what Marcuse called one-dimensional society, in which the possible is reduced to the real. Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man does itself no favors, and I'm not surprised that it is often read as a simple criticism and explanation of capitalism, and particularly the capitalist state, that justifies the politics we inherit today from the New Left. But its proper object must include the left and its history. Otherwise, the book cannot be understood and seems to have two souls. So, what is unique about the Frankfurt School? What constitutes their Marxism? And what is unique about Marxism? As a guide to reality or description of capitalism and class struggle, Marcuse's or Adorno's writings are nothing special. Where they are at odds with the spirit of the day is in their seeming pessimism, their recognition of deep failure and insistence that the failure of Marxism, socialism, and the left be examined critically. To excise this pessimism and critical edge from the Frankfurt School is precisely to excise its Marxism. Marxism never took socialism, communism, and the politics of the working class for granted. In State and Revolution, which Adorno called in a letter to Walter Benjamin the greatest of all political books, Lenin writes, quote, "The main point in Marx's teachings is the class struggle. This is very often said and written, but it is not true. And it is from this untruth that there very often results an opportunist distortion of Marxism. its falsification in such a way as to make it acceptable to the bourgeoisie. For the doctrine of the class struggle was created not by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Those who recognize only the class struggle are not yet Marxists. They may be situated still within the framework of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. To limit Marxism to the doctrine of the class struggle means to chop up Marxism, distort and reduce it to something acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Only those persons are Marxists who extend the recognition of class struggle as far as the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what constitutes the most profound difference between the Marxist and the ordinary, petty, as well as grand bourgeoisie." End quote. The dictatorship of the proletariat emerged in Marxist thought after the failure of the 1848 revolutions, when the bourgeoisie could no longer lead the revolution and the proletariat was not yet ready to lead the revolution. The mass democracy in which the working class movement had grown turned in on itself, and many leftists and socialists supported Louis Bonaparte's democratically elected authoritarian regime and suppression of revolutionary discontent, often in the name of socialism. The necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a recognition of the failure of socialism, communism, and the left to transform society for human freedom, not some description of a structure of capitalism. To have a critical theory of society and capitalism, one must have a critical theory of the left. For the left and the politics of socialism are products of capitalism and represent the real possibilities for transformation in society. Transformation towards socialism and freedom, or towards a new phase of capitalist domination. This is why, as Rosa Luxemburg said, the proletariat learns through defeat. The Marxism of the Frankfurt School lies in their ruthless criticism of everything existing, their ruthless criticism of the left and the failures of Marxism in history. Thank you.
All right. I first want to express my thanks to all the folks at Platypus for putting this together. It's amazing to see elements of New York's intellectual life finally returning in person. And we're returning at a moment when the rhetoric of crisis proliferates. From Brexit to Trump to climate catastrophe to racial insurrection, the COVID-19 pandemic created a further multi-pronged crisis. And it's in such moments that critical social theory, like that of the Frankfurt School, might have something to teach us. At least that's what I wagered when early on in the pandemic, I co-authored a manifesto for public seminar called Theses for Theory in a Time of Crisis, really inspired by the Frankfurt School, and curated a series of reflections along with it. Almost exactly 5 years ago, on December 5th, 2016, a month after Trump's election shocked more of us than would now admit it, the New Yorker's Alex Ross published a piece called "The Frankfurt School Knew Trump Was Coming." And a few months later, I was invited to speak on a panel by the same name. All these intellectuals in this circle were roused into fierce debates about the meaning of Trump and Trumpism, whether a Reichstag fire of our own was imminent, whether Trump could rightly be called a fascist, or the migrant detention camps at the southern border were really concentration camps, and debates about the value of such historical analogies generally. These debates, I think, revitalized intellectual traditions of critical thought and German and Jewish history by giving them relevance, sometimes even a sense of dire emergency that many academics rarely experience. A friend of mine asked me the morning after Trump's election, "Is it too soon to celebrate your career prospects as a historian of catastrophe?" During these debates, the political theorist Corey Robin invoked the Frankfurt School to stress continuities between Trump and the conservative elites who enabled his election. Robin turned to a 1939 essay by Max Horkheimer, who famously wrote, "Whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about fascism." And he reprised this today, "Whoever is not prepared to talk about Bushism should also remain silent about Trumpism." For Robin, Trump's novelty lay not in the invention, but rather in the weaponization of well-established forms of American nativism and ruling class domination. These debates were driven by a desire to know where Trump came from, to understand how such a barbarian could, to invoke Benjamin, still rise to power in this day and age. In that Benjaminian moment of danger, leading critical theorists such as Professor Bernstein returned to the Frankfurt School's work on mass media, propaganda, psychological projection, and theories of authoritarian character types and attachments that supported the racialized us-them distinctions that figures like Trump mobilized. The most important conclusion of the most famous of these works, The Authoritarian Personality from 1950, I think was exactly wrong in the mainstream interpretation. It's precisely not the individualistic fixation on Trump as a uniquely pathological character that was so often undertaken by the liberal resistance, but rather, as Adorno suggested in his previously unpublished dissenting remarks on that published work, the argument that pathological figures like Trump are a symptom of general social regression. In Adorno's words, people are inevitably as irrational as the world in which they live. Hence, that book concludes that the pervasiveness of the potentially fascist personality type, because it is the product of, quote, the total organization of society, can be changed only once that society is changed. Against the tendency of the liberal resistance to draw upon thinkers such as Adorno or Arendt to pathologize Trump and his followers through references to their authoritarian personalities or resonances with fascist figures, Adorno argues that this distracts us from the more important task of transforming that total organization of society, which underlies and constantly reproduces regressive tendencies like racism, anti-Semitism, economic exploitation. So this brings me to the question of politics that brings us here today, and this discussion from 1956 toward a new manifesto. The discussion reflects a frustration of the left in a moment Daniel Bell famously called the end of ideology, a time which, as Adorno says, a time in which, Adorno says, what Hegel and Marx called utopianism has been rendered obsolete by the present stage of history. Adorno says later on, we do not live in a revolutionary situation, and actually things are worse than ever. The horror is that for the first time we live in a world in which we can no longer imagine a better one. So this realization signals the closing of the future-oriented and utopian horizon of expectations that defines political modernity. Adorno and Horkheimer find themselves in a dilemma that still faces the left today. On the one hand, Adorno says, their discussion should at all costs avoid a debased form of Marxism, by which he means a positivistic, sharp divide between ideas and materiality. But on the other hand, Adorno says, we must not abandon Marxist terminology, for as Horkheimer agrees with him, we have nothing else. And as the older, more resigned, and even self-described defeatist Horkheimer puts it even more cynically, is the political question still relevant at a time when you cannot act politically? He concludes, the only thing that goes against my pessimism is the fact that we still carry on thinking today. All hope lies in thought. However, when faced with concrete political situations in later years, Adorno was far less abstract and resigned. He articulates a far more positive political vision in a newly translated essay I recently reviewed. That text is the 1967 lecture, Aspects of the New Right-Wing Extremism, which Adorno gave in response to the rise of the German National Party, a far-right precursor in the 60s to the current AfD. Toward the end of his life, and still today, Adorno's reputation was torn between his theoretical debt and socialist commitments to Marx and Lenin versus the institutional realities that he was, in some respects, a social democrat and not a Soviet-lined communist. He was friends with left liberal politicians, he led a public research institute, and he was president of mainstream academic associations. He returned to Germany after the war, after all, to shape the development of the liberal democratic culture that was in ruins after the post-Nazi state collapsed, and he wanted to educate a new generation of Germans. Yet the main point I make in my article is that when Adorno engaged Germany's liberal democratic order, as he does in this 1967 lecture, that liberal democracy requires what he called its socioeconomic content to be realized if it's not to remain merely formal, or democracy in name only. In that sense, Adorno says, one might refer to the fascist movements as the wounds or the scars of democracy that to this day has not lived up to its own concept. The main reason Adorno gives for this resurgence of quasi-fascist movements in Germany was, quote, the still prevailing tendency towards concentration of capital. Resulting in immiseration, Adorno says, put continual pressure on the petty bourgeoisie, who in turn, he says, want to cling to and possibly reinforce their privileges and social status. This kind of analysis closely echoes sophisticated work on particular class alignments that continue to support the far right today. And it's hardly out of step also with the radical views of the students who rebuffed Adorno in this time. So what can critical theory contribute to understanding the contradictions of contemporary society and to movements seeking to transform it? Adorno maintained commitment to materialist analysis of what he called the social totality, inspired by thinkers we've mentioned, Marx, Lenin, Lukács. But at the same time, he claims in the new manifesto, we must not provide a picture of a positive utopia. While rejecting a positive conception of practice in the absence of a coherent left party, the thing the two thinkers could agree on is Horkheimer's claim that by practice, we really mean that we are serious about the idea that the world needs fundamental change. Horkheimer leaves us with the thought that while the prospects for the realization of theory in political formations often seems grim in the absence of an organized left, we go on doing critical theory in settings like this one, because perhaps the time will come again when theory can be of use. And I find powerful resonances between Adorno and Horkheimer's reflections on nature and our intensifying climate catastrophe today. Adorno says in the dialogue, isn't what human beings do to nature a projection of what they do to one another, hitting out at the outside world because they are always being humiliated? Contemporary theorists like Nancy Fraser, Andreas Malm, Dipesh Chakrabarty have done important work linking these interrelated violences against nature and against forms of social oppression. They revise and revisit Benjamin and Adorno's conception of history as permanent catastrophe and see it realized in the way capitalist modernity is built upon mastery of nature that continually reproduces conditions of crisis, unsustainable exploitation and pillage of natural and human resources, immiseration and inequality, and generalized precarity. Yet Adorno recognized that state socialist societies at the time were hardly better off, as they too were organized around maximizing extractivist production. As Adorno once glossed Horkheimer in a lecture, he says, in Marx, the principle of the domination of nature is accepted quite naively. Hence, the image of the classless society in Marx has something of the quality of a gigantic joint stock company for the exploitation of nature. The necessity of such a critical theory remains, even as Adorno said in 1968, reflecting on the question of the relevance of Marx for sociology. Perhaps today's world can simply no longer be captured by an internally consistent theory, because the irrationality of the current social structure resists its rational grasp at the theoretical level. Of course, so much has changed since Adorno wrote this essay, but still, when Adorno reflects on what hasn't changed between his time and Marx's, I think there's some insight, namely that people are still appendages to machines. And when I hear this line, I think of reports we hear today of Amazon delivery drivers without breaks having to pee in bottles, or the truly dystopian reports of precarious food delivery workers putting their lives at risk, zooming through red lights to deliver us donuts on demand. I'll end with a chilling observation from Adorno in 1968 that to me still rings true. Human needs have become a function of the machinery of production rather than vice versa to a much greater extent than could ever have been foreseen in Marx's day. Thanks.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. Before I give the opportunity of each one responding, I just want to give a brief summary of each one's argument, so for both the audience and the panelists. So Jay brought in how there needs to be an expansion from the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, from Adorno and Horkheimer's theory, and the most appropriate extension of this theory is the ecofeminist theory of today, because it goes beyond the Adorno's failure of bad utopianism and actually takes into account the need for the repair of the ecosystem, and the need to take into account how social reproduction and production have gone completely separated from each other, and actually social reproduction is in a way subsumed to production itself, and need to go back to the idea of primitive accumulation, which goes back to the idea of how the system is not, so socialism is not a unitary system, but actually a constellation, and that's how one needs to approach it. And so, in this need to understand the absence of the politics of revolutionary politics today, the most appropriate way is to understand and have an appropriate analysis of the climate crisis, which we are being led to, which the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School did not analyze in the way that we are living it today. Aaron brought in how that the unique point about the Frankfurt School and about Marxism is not the importance of class struggle or an analysis of class struggle, that's actually a bourgeois doctrine. And actually, we need to go to the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And lastly, Catlin was telling us both about the authoritarian personality and how the need to pathologize individual personalities is actually a symptom of regression, and that what critical theory can actually help us today is to keep on understanding how our human needs are still in a dire situation, even worse from the theory of the Frankfurt School. And we need to have freedom from production. Instead of production being the end of man, now we have man being the end of production. And so now I'm going to give the opportunity for each of the panelists for about 2 to 3 minutes to answer to each other. And so let's start with Jay Bernstein.
So thank you both for your comments. So it seems to me, thinking first about Aaron's presentation, that we just keep needing to remind ourselves about why the Communist Party disappeared, a theme of the manifesto, why Marxism has not been present at this very moment it is most necessary. And the answer to that, on my understanding, is obviously the failure of the Soviet Union. But along with that, the idea, and this is what I call one-dimensional Marxism, that the thought is Marxism is about transferring ownership of the means of production from the capitalists to the workers. Who owns the means of production? And that, the difficulty of that is the model of the answer to that model just left out the idea that there could be any kind of notion of a market. And it turns out that we don't understand an economy as either a demand or a market economy, and hence paralysis. Now, I think I want to say 2 things to that dilemma. I think that's an accurate picture of the dilemma. Maybe you don't, but that's how I understand the dilemma. And the first is to remind people that there was a debate in Hungarian Marxism between Lukács and Polanyi, right? They're both Hungarian Marxists, and Polanyi came up in particular because he thought all history is not the history of class struggle. He thought that wasn't what made capitalism capitalism. He thought what made capitalism capitalism was And he now, going back to volume 1, the opening chapter of Commodity Fetishism, it's making land, labor, and money into commodities. And he says the obvious. Human labor is not a commodity. You treat it like a commodity, you treat it as if it's not human. Land is not a commodity, you treat it as a commodity, and you get the Anthropocene. Money is not a commodity, it's a means of exchange. So the first thing he said is what we can imagine is a process of decommodifying land, labor, and money. Okay. So that would be the first project, and he calls that project democracy. Democracy would be control over the economy for the sake of a sustainable economy based on sustainability and needs. And that brings me to the second thought, that over and over again, what we hear from Marcuse, from Adorno, from Horkheimer, is we can no longer imagine a better world that was not simply utopia. And my argument is we absolutely can. We can easily do it. Not difficult to imagine tons of things. We're doing one now. How do we go from using fossil fuels to renewable energy? That would be a better world. How do we get CO2 emissions down under 420? That would be a better world. How do we stop industrial farming? That would be a better world. We have tons of ideas for a better world. It's no longer the case that we have no imagination of alternatives. What we lack is an adequate politics.
Thanks, Jay. I am going to have to take slight issue with your characterization of Marxism, as you might imagine. And it's actually part of the reason that I quoted Lenin in the introduction, because I think often things are ascribed to Marxism, which are in fact from bourgeois liberalism or from pre-Marxian socialism and communism. And what you described, the idea that the means of production need to be in the hands of the proletariat, is an idea that predates Marx, and which Marx criticized as a dogmatic abstraction. It's a one-sided abstraction, because if the means of production were socialized, then society would just be one giant capitalist over all of the workers, and that's his criticism of Proudhon and the poverty of philosophy. And then also it's, again, in Das Kapital, he writes about it. And the reason that I think that's important is because for Marx, communism is a symptom of capitalism and of capitalist crisis. That the existence of the demand for the socialization of the means of production, for worker control of the means of production, and for the abolition of private property, which would be necessary to create that, is a demand of capitalism. That capitalism actually creates that demand. It undermines the ability of private property to mediate our relations of production so that the value, the social value of our labor is recognized. And so for that reason, Marx would say that, well, this is already happening, right? The beginning of the Communist Manifesto, everything the communists are accused of is already happening in capitalism. And what something like what Polanyi wants, right? The democratic control over the means of production, is that not just the same demand for the abolition of private property conducted through the state? Is that not just the progressive capitalist state overseeing the demand for the abolition of private property? The question that I would like to pose two questions to both of you that I think are important. One is about this idea of decommodification. I wonder, Jay, what you think about Lukács's argument, which I think is taken up by Adorno, and I think they both get it from Marxism, which is that the point isn't to decommodify, right, but rather to work through commodification. So Hannah Arendt said in the 70s that the Communist Manifesto was the greatest endorsement of capitalism ever written for this reason, because the point for Marxists isn't to decommodify, it's rather to commodify everythh and to realize the potential of commodifying everything. And so the way Lukács puts it, which I think is very helpful, is that in reified humanity, reification finds its outer limits, meaning that the potential of instrumental reason dominating society is the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's turning the proletariat into the subject and object of history so that it can transform itself for human freedom. That act will allow us to overcome the necessity of labor, which is now only a social necessity. And so I just wonder what you think of that idea, which I think is an attempt to uphold the bourgeois dialectic with regards to the commodity, as opposed to, forms of socialism that existed in Marx's time that he criticized as, reactionary. And I don't mean that in like a pejorative way. I know today that word only means evil things, but as attempting to go back, to undo what's happened, to undo the freedom that's attended to the commodification of the world. Because when labor wasn't a commodity, it was a form of social coercion. And then the other question I have is, you both brought up regression, the idea that things are getting worse, right? That maybe things are worse than Nazism. And I don't remember exactly how you put it, John, but I know you mentioned it too. And I'm very sorry about that. There's been a lot of discussion already. It's only like 6 minutes in. But I wondered why you think that the idea of things getting worse is so important to the Frankfurt School, and what it really means. I mean, my sense is that it has to do not only with, the fact that progress in capitalism might be progress in barbarism, which I think, Jay, should have us questioning the idea that we can have this progress by finding all of these different, little ways to make the world better, that perhaps making the world better will end up after the fact looking like progress in barbarism. And I also think that they're thinking about the failure of the left in the early 20th century and the profound failure of the left in their time to even tell the truth about the fact that the revolution has failed, that the intellectuals are being kicked out of the party, that they have to be social democrats or they have to be these like left liberals, that they can't participate in the Communist Party, and that leftists are lying about the fact that the revolution is being liquidated before their very eyes. So I just wonder what you guys think about that.
I'll be brief, but I guess I'll start with this idea from the manifesto, this claim in this 1956 that they feel themselves, Horkheimer and Adorno, heading toward a situation compared to which Nazism is a farce. And this is basically the idea that I've been working with in my own work, is this theory of history as a permanent catastrophe. That's the phrase in Adorno that he gets from Benjamin. And yeah, I really, my take on this really resonates with Professor Bernstein's take, that, the moment for this kind of thought may have been missed in the collapse of democracy, the rise of fascism, the threat of nuclear war is probably what they're referring to here. But today, in the face of climate catastrophe, all of this theory faces a new relevance. And these political questions have indeed, I think, opened up an opportunity. I think Nancy Fraser is one of the most interesting theorists today working on this kind of intersection. And I think it's telling that she is really equally inspired, I would say, by Marx and by Polanyi. Because if you want an account of why it is that the ecological catastrophe is actually opening up a political crisis, in addition to creating political crises like the right-wing regressions that we've seen in the past years, you need a kind of crisis theory that I think can't just take place in the economic sphere. It needs to address social reproduction. It needs to be ecological. And yeah, on this point of regression, a really interesting book came out in, I think, 2016 or 2017 called The Great Regression. And Zizek wrote a chapter, Nancy Fraser wrote a chapter. And the whole conceit of that book, I basically agree with, which is that we need to be able to say on the left that Trump was a regression. And what that means from a theoretical standpoint is that we need a minimal conception of progress that is somehow revised, somehow unlinked from these progressive teleologies of endless growth and productivism that have really marred, and of course, domination of all kinds, colonial domination, that have really marred the concept of progress for a very long time. So yeah, I'm with thinkers like Rahul Yegi has a great piece on this also, that we should have a concept of what progress is on the left, and it doesn't have to be that old problematic concept. Just like I think we need a concept of regression. We need to be able to make social analytic claims when events happen that we can say are good or bad for our movements.
Let's do a last response to Jay. Would you like to respond to Aaron's question that was directed at you, or if not, we can go directly to the Q&A. So I'll give you that opportunity.
Okay. One shot, 'cause I'm not sure I followed. So in volume 3 of Capital, Marx says someday people will find the idea of owning land as utterly bizarre as we now find owning another person. And he goes on to say, so he now offers his clear thesis about what decommodification of land is, that we are stewards of the land, we are trustees or fiduciaries of the land for future generations. So it seems to me that decommodification of land is a perfectly clear idea. Marx had it. The idea of no ownership is not one of the state ownership, but the idea of holding something in trust for the future in its well-being. That is, Marx had some idea of the sustainability of land. It's a long story, but so did Jefferson. And Adam Smith. So we actually have a model that's already built in. I can go into constitutional law. It's actually already in constitutional law, how to treat lands as fiduciaries. So it seems to me this is an important model about how we can get past private property. Not with difficulty, but easily. It's not somehow difficult. So I really don't understand the question about decommodification. And I take it that the thought about history getting worse is the transition from the Holocene to the Anthropocene. That all of history for the last 11,700 years ago was based on the relative fecundity, stability, and moderateness of Holocene nature. And even Marx took the idea of Holocene nature for granted. Everyone did, right? It turns out what we thought was nature was just an historical fragment of the history of the Earth system. And we're now in a different geological epoch, one that is getting closer to the Pleistocene, in which settled civilization will be impossible. So yeah, I do think things are getting worse. I think they are getting dire. And I think the idea of utopia is no longer intelligible because utopia was a project of Holocene nature. Okay, I'll stop.
Aaron, would you like to respond to that? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think actually that nobody in Marx's time had, I don't think it's the case that nobody in Marx's time had a sense of ecological disaster. I mean, certainly the Malthusians did, and different people in different ways. I mean, Marx treated the environment through political economy, meaning how do we mediate our relationship to nature? We mediate our relationship to nature through labor. And so, the idea, for example, that owning land would become meaningless because rents would go to zero, which is Adam Smith's idea in The Wealth of Nations, is precisely the result of the commodification of land and labor and the value of labor, which means that, okay, well, over time, the value in owning a piece of land is going to be nothing compared to the value somebody can create by working the land. And so rents are going to go to zero. That is reversed because of the massive capitalist cities that attend to industrial society. But, I don't think that the disaster is the Anthropocene. I mean, I'll just say one last thing, and then we can get to Q&A and we can discuss it more. When I was a little kid, like when I was 6 years old, my dad printed out a blog post about terraforming Mars, and I read it, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I wanted to do it. It was my dream when I was 6 years old. And turns out the way to do it is exactly the same way that we're creating the climate crisis, that everything we're doing to create the climate crisis, if done in a purposeful, free way, as a free act, would turn Mars into a habitable planet, at least theoretically. I know this is silly sci-fi example, but the point is that it's not so bad that we change nature. And in fact, the only reason that anybody says that the Holocene is a good thing is because we're here to judge it, and because we've transformed it enough to think maybe we can transform it in a bad way too. And so, I don't know. I think at the very beginning of One-Dimensional Man, when Marcuse talks about the threat of catastrophe, I think what he's talking about there isn't the people holding the bombs necessarily. It's the leftists who are saying that we're all going to die from nuclear catastrophe unless we ditch utopia and ditch revolutionary politics and put all of our energy into pacifism. I think what's his name? I have his name. It's not Andre Gortz. I was about to say Andre Gortz. That's not the man. But anyway, there's a leftist who wrote an essay about it a bit later in the 70s, but was probably spouting this stuff in the 60s. I think that's the type of thing he had in mind. And I think it's unfortunate if the idea that we're headed towards imminent crisis, which is produced by capitalism, make no mistake, it has been since the 1840s, right? That the world's going to end. I think it would be really unfortunate if we allowed that to foreclose political possibility.
Since I gave both of them the opportunity of a second response, would you like? All right. So let's head on to the Q&A. Whoever has a question, just raise your hand, and Danny's gonna come. Who has a question? David.
Hey, so I have two questions, one for Jay and one for John. For Jay, I'm curious about what got you interested in Marxism back in the 60s during the New Left, and what relatedly, and maybe for different reasons, led you to your interest in Adorno and Frankfurt School critical theory. I'm curious to know more about what was the constellation of power and conditions of possibility for revolutionary politics then, and what was your apprehension and imagination of it, and how is that different from what you see as possible today, and what's the relationship between these two moments? My question for John has to do with, it seems like the authoritarian personality plays a large role in how you approach the Frankfurt School. And I think it's no secret that for Adorno, the authoritarian personality is kind of epochal. It doesn't just apply to the right wing, but also it applies to the social democrats and Stalinists, and also liberal democracy. And famously, maybe infamously, Adorno actually referred to the student activists in the New Left in 1968 as left fascists. So I'm curious to know what you might think about this kind of more epochal approach that Adorno had to the analysis of fascism. Why would Adorno have this analysis? And also, I guess, you kind of described how Adorno had this theory of the pressure from capital, the kind of proletarianization of the petty bourgeoisie, leading to a kind of constant reposing of the crisis of petty bourgeois democracy. like, so you have like a petty bourgeoisie run amok, reposing a kind of need for something that looks like fascism, or like what older Marxists used to call Bonapartism. I wonder if that similar analysis could be applied to, any tendency within capitalist democracy today. So maybe it could be applied to the left as much as the right. It's a provocative way to pose the question, but I wonder what you might think of that provocation. What do I give this?
Oh, there's 5 minutes. We've done for 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so this question about the authoritarian personality concept, and this is important to I guess my Frankfurt School, which basically came through the exilic writings. So the response to fascism, in Minima Moralia, Dialectic of Enlightenment, the essays on fascist propaganda, the authoritarian personality, and then a kind of similar work that Adorno undertook in Germany, Guilt and Defense, about German guilt on the Holocaust. I guess I'm basing most of my remarks off of this dissent that Adorno wrote to the Authoritarian Personality Project, which is only included in the new edition that came out about 2 years ago, which was not published for obvious reasons for 70 years, which is that Adorno fundamentally disagrees with the way that categories like the potential fascist and the whole notion of the authoritarian personality, any kind of social scientific category like that, if it isn't sufficiently reflexive about where the category is coming from and what it means, it becomes a kind of reification, and it becomes positivistic. You can use social science. We now know this is almost common sense now. You can use social science to posit and project categories everywhere, wherever you want to see them. And Adorno was doing this project in the kind of heyday of empirical sociology, where you could get tons of money to do these huge empirical projects that were totally positivist and uncritical. But the question stands of, what does it mean to apply these categories not only to the right, but also to the left? So, some of the features of the authoritarian personality are, authoritarian parenting styles. It actually has like a content, a deference to authority. And basically, I would say these align with conservative types. So I guess it's a provocative question when you put it in a political context, that a figure like a Habermas or an Adorno in the setting of the 60s, could kind of deploy this category in a polemical way of saying the student movements in their rigidity. Adorno has this famous line in his last interview: I never thought my students, when I was training them in critical social theory, would try to implement my theories with Molotov cocktails. But yeah, I mean, when, the things like what he talks about in this debate with Marcuse, occupying the institute, and basically when it becomes acceptable to use what he saw as anti-intellectual tactics, which was like destroying a research institute, when that becomes acceptable. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the fascist category, like in any sense, even to describe the contemporary right. I've always been on that side of the debate. For some of the reasons I mentioned, I don't think calling Trump even a fascist was very productive. And yeah, I wouldn't endorse, calling elements of the left fascistic, even though we might want to criticize all sorts of organizational tactics.
So thank you for the question, and I won't give you a satisfying answer, because in '68 I wasn't thinking hard about Marxism. I was in the streets, and I was thinking about egalitarian democratic citizenship. Right, that seemed to me, and still my project. Right, I deeply believe in egalitarian democratic citizenship. And I was shocked as an 18-year-old that what liberals said was their beliefs, they did nothing to put into reality. So it was the gap. What shifted me in my thinking, so I then turned to Marx to understand the problem, And my Marx, I guess as you know, is Lukács, was my first love, passion. And I read Lukács very differently than you do, I think. For me, Lukács' great thought is, first of all, he said, all history is not the history of class struggle. He said, capitalism is. Capitalism is about class struggle. But then he went on to say, and it's a thought I've never been able to shake, that each form of life, each historical epoch, is an experiment in what it means to be human. And it's an extraordinary great idea that humanity is a series of historical experiments. That's why there's no utopia. Utopia is a terrible idea. Every time we introduce a form of life, we're experimenting on the idea of the human. And we need a new experiment desperately. I changed from Lukács to Adorno, as often is the case, because my dearest and closest friend in life was Gillian Rose, and she just beat me up and argued, and we talked on the phone every night for 20 years, and she won. I listened, but it was the thought, and this is not Rose's reading of Adorno. I don't think she really got Adorno. He understood the problem of the domination of nature better, fuller, I think, than anyone else. So I disagree. I don't think it was out there. I don't think it's common. I think he had the most systematic account of what the domination was nature of. And that's why he's present now. Because he understands the connection between the domination of nature and the domination of capital in class society. And no one else has put those two together as systematically as his social theory does. So that makes him invaluable, right? And on my reading, of course, the eco-feminists read him, right? Carolyn Merchant knew his work. Val Plumwood knew his work. Ariel Soleil knew his work. I mean, this is not like an accident that ecofeminism has these echoes. They are taking it and rechanneling it, which is, I think, creative and helpful.
Thank you. Next question on the back.
Thanks. I have a question about the idea that the revolutionary potential of the climate crisis. And I'm wondering if there's a distinction to be made between the climate crisis writ large versus global warming. Because I can sort of see the argument that, you know, there's a system of domination of nature that is inherent to capitalism, which people, you know, like in the way that it rests on the rupture that Professor Bernstein mentioned between production and reproduction. But it strikes me that global warming is a more specific problem that is, in some sense, incidental to that sort of inherent logic in capitalism. It feels like it might have been more of a, I mean, it couldn't have been predicted from the way that that capitalism is structured. So I don't really see how the current environmental crisis can be seen as a distinct or new thing in terms of the threat it poses to capitalism. I don't know if that, like the cycles of habitat destruction and everything might have been predicted in the 19th century and understood and theorized, but you know, so I'm curious to understand what it is about this present moment that feels different, and specifically how it threatens capitalism.
So at least on my understanding, and you'll excuse if I talk like a philosopher for 30 seconds, a minimum necessary condition, this is a transcendental argument, a minimum necessary condition for the possibility of a social formation is that it secures its own conditions of social reproduction. That is, it has to be able to provide the conditions whereby future generations can continue on in the practice. That is no longer the case. That's what the Anthropocene means. It means literally that you are going to have worse opportunities to exploit nature every single year of your lives. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. The weather's going to get worse. The resources are going to get fewer. The conditions are going to get more exploitative. And the social conditions will become unmanageable, right? So just to underline the obvious, we haven't talked about it, the right has been thinking about climate change for 25 years in Europe and in the United States. They've decided that we can't do anything about it. That climate change, we can't do anything about it. Therefore, we have a problem. And the problem is it's going to affect the global South disastrously. It already is, with droughts, with poverty, with severe weather, with flooding. Bangladesh is going to be disastrous. Ergo, there's going to be massive migrations north over the next century. What are we going to do about it? And they have an answer. The Trump answer: build a wall. The right throughout Europe is building a wall. In Hungary, in Poland, in France, they have a policy of economic nationalism that's directly tied to their understanding of the climate crisis, and the left has had no response whatsoever. So I do think it's specific. It undermines the, so literally capitalism has failed because it can no longer carry on, right? That was Holocene nature. And secondly, it's failed socially because socially it's not allowed for growth to continue the dynamism to take the edge of exploitation and poverty, right? That's what's happening in the global South. So yeah, I think we're in a new, wholly different crisis situation. I'm not an optimist.
Just plug one thing. I'll just plug two talks. I haven't worked out this problem for myself, but in 2019 at the New School, Etienne Balibar and Nancy Fraser both gave talks on their takes on the climate crisis. And I just found it fascinating how two of our leading critical theorists today have totally opposite interpretations on basically this problematic that you've laid out. So I would say Fraser is what I would call a crisis optimist. She thinks that every climate catastrophe has a radicalizing function for people, wakens them to the problems of capitalism, of social reproduction. It builds new coalitions. There's obviously tons of movements from the global South that that have prominence now that they didn't used to have. So she sees it as a movement building opportunity for the left, and therefore it's actually a crisis. It's actually a moment of decision. And it can be politicized. So that's like the optimistic scenario, which is articulated, in some fringes of the Sanders movement and a lot of the global South. And then on the other hand, there's Etienne Balibar, who gave this talk called Socialism Before the Catastrophe, where it's basically just this kind of Hobbesian cycle of just violence, which is not political for him. It's just this exclusionary, armed lifeboat model of what climate emergency will do, and he thinks it'll basically just reinforce the right all around the world, and re-entrench all these kinds of nationalisms. So it's a very bleak portrait, but I'm somewhere between those two images. But I think they're useful kind of concepts or ideal types of one's political take on this.
I'm just going to take a moment to call a spade, and I had a feeling that this might be the case when you quoted that thing about the riff on Horkheimer that don't talk about Trumpism if you're not going to talk about Bushism. What about Obamaism? But it seems to me that the reason that the climate catastrophe is now, and it wasn't 6 years ago, is Trump. And I wonder if anybody needs Marxism to like make the arguments that we've just heard. As in, the idea that like Trump and these different right wingers are like uniquely bad at immigration policy. First of all, probably isn't true. Obama was the deporter in chief. But it seems as though climate has been taken up by the Democratic Party in the last 5 years as a way of trying to galvanize their base, and that AOC and others have kind of used this as well. They've like rode the tailwinds of this, things like the Green New Deal, and that is progressive state capitalism, and I mean that's fine. But I just wonder why Adorno and why Marxism are needed to justify politics that appear to me to be kind of social democratic, left liberal. And I don't know that, Adorno's kind of unique ideas about the potential for a revolutionary transformation of society and the importance of the deep failures of politics in history to turn the working class from an object to a subject of politics, right? To give them an independent politics. I don't know what that really has to do with the way that, this kind of climate change catastrophism is being used politically. I know that was, you guys can say stuff to me because that was a bit much to put at the end of a discussion.
Great. Lots of questions. There should be.
Next question.
Hi. This is the main part of this. My question is directed to Jay. I'm taken aback when you say that transitioning from fossil fuels to sustainable energy production is easy. It's not easy. There are vast, powerful political obstacles in the way, which can only be overcome through, as Aaron mentioned, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, it can't just happen. We just can't do this. We just can't go out and put up windmills and conquer global warming. We've got to create a new political structure.
I agree.
Okay.
I don't disagree with a word of that.
Okay, good. The second question is for Jonathan. I'm glad we agree totally. My second question is for Jonathan. When you talk about about the regressiveness of Donald Trump, which of course he is regressive, but you mentioned you took part in some kind of panel discussion organized by the New Yorker magazine or Andrew Ross of the New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker magazine is the Trump bashing outlet par excellence. They blame everything on either Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin. Okay, and so so that analysis strikes me as not only incorrect but profoundly reactionary. I mean, Trump is merely the intensification of certain trends that were already, more than evident. And what's followed Trump has been a further intensification. And if Trump comes back in 2024, as I think he probably will if he doesn't die of a heart attack, we'll see an exponential rise in those tendencies. But they can't be reduced to one man, as the Democrats try to do, including led by the New Yorker. Anyway, that's it.
Did you agree with that too?
Yeah, that's been my take. I should say that so that article I use as a talking point because it is this liberal invocation of thinkers like Adorno. It's the wrong reading of the authoritarian personality. And Hannah Arendt famously also, who has amazing historical insights that are not they're not the liberal Arendt, that's been like weaponized against Trump by Masha Gessen and Tim Snyder and all these people. So yeah, basically I would say I'm in agreement with that. I don't have any affiliation with the New Yorker, but I was on a panel that stole that title because I think it's true that the Frankfurt School does have mostly in the writings on psychology and psychoanalytic theories of fascism, which are way more structural than this idea of pathologizing one, individual person or classes of deplorables. It's a much more, systematic analysis of social totality and patterns of mass propaganda, which I do think are helpful and don't necessarily have to fit this individualizing, liberal analysis.
Yeah, if people have not read Adorno's essay on fascist propaganda, it's uncanny how accurately it anticipates Trump. I mean, every single tactic, every feature of his relationship with his followers is laid out in detail. And I always hated the essay because I thought it was an after-the-fact analysis of Hitler. And I thought, oh, it can't be true. When Trump came along, I thought, oh, there really is this deep structure. It's really a tremendous essay of Adorno's.
And also, I'll just plug Prophets of Deceit, which is a really long forgotten book by Leo Lobenthal and Norbert Kuchermann that was just republished by Verso. Also, just uncanny reading these passages of right-wing agitators on American radio from the 1930s. Any of these passages could be taken from Trump.
I mean, so, is this on?
Yeah.
There we go. It was off. Hopefully people heard you. I mean, I think it was about 10 minutes ago that you guys said it was unhelpful to call Trump a fascist. So the conversation has kind of taken that turn very quickly.
I didn't mention the word.
Of fascist propaganda.
That was the title of the essay.
Yeah, and you said that Trump follows the pattern of fascist propaganda.
Yeah.
And the Democrats don't?
So if you read that essay, then absolutely not.
Okay.
That essay,
Tell me how, oh, Jesus. Oh, God. Well, because I think Adorno would say that the worshiping of the accomplished fact, right, which the Democrats' propaganda, which the propaganda du jour of mainstream capitalist politics reproduces, is typified by things like the really reaction against transformations in capitalism that are represented by Trump. I mean, that's one way of putting it. I mean, okay, to get it back to critical theory, I do want to take it back a bit to Adorno and critical theory, which I wonder what you all made of the ideas I tried to put forward in my opening remarks, that the Marxism of Adorno comes precisely from the criticism of the left and of his reflections on the failure of socialist, communist, leftist politics and how they point towards the necessity of transforming those politics, as opposed to criticisms of capitalism, which may in fact just alibi the next stage of capitalism. And I think this gets to, the issue about the propaganda, because of course it's propaganda to say that like Trump is like some horrible, huge racist who said all these like things, whatever. I mean, it is Democratic Party propaganda. They put it out there to get people to vote for them. It doesn't really, I think, speak to like what Trump's appeal to the masses are. That's a different story, but certainly it's used on both sides. And it's used to alibi, the current regime of the state that we're all living under because of COVID, for example. And the transformations in capitalism that are happening, that are being overseen by, a perhaps more politically correct, balanced ruling class bureaucracy that nevertheless is not going to mean the substantial betterment of the masses of workers in America who are Black, white, from every country, right, of all creeds, races, genders. It's not going to mean the better, substantial betterment of their lives that you have, more representation in the new form of government or something like that. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's happening right now. And the criticisms of the Frankfurt School, if they stay at the level of kind of describing problems in capitalism I don't know that they go beyond the way that capitalism criticizes itself to reproduce itself. That's like really the question if we kind of walk from contemporary politics to the purpose of critical theory. I hope that was at least somewhat clear. I did have a bit of trouble getting us there, but do we need that? Do we need the Marxism of the Frankfurt School? Because it sounds like the Frankfurt School, but you two want to use the Frankfurt School as a way of describing the system of capitalism and showing what sort of progress can be made. And that even when that takes the form of harsh criticisms, and you'll remember this from Lukács, that may just mean alibying the new phase of capitalism, which somebody like Trump represented. And now, you know, the status quo that will take back power from him will represent too.
No, I'm not really following. So I'm just slightly puzzled, right? First of all, there's not one chapter of negative dialectics that's about Marx. It's all about a critique of bourgeois philosophy as a theory of rationality. And it's claiming that the theory of instrumental reason is the underlying structure that connects science, technology, capital reproduction, and bourgeois politics. And it's claiming that we need another conception of rationality to have another theory of our relationship to nature, another theory of our relationship to one another, and another conception of politics. I don't understand why one would think that's an apology for capital.
The reason would be because capital is what creates the discontent with instrumental reason. As in the crisis of capitalism and the dissolution of society creates a spontaneous discontent that's represented by liberal, sometimes socialist, communist politics with that instrumental reason. And I think Adorno negative dialectics is making as apropos the title, much more dialectical argument about instrumental reason, namely that the desire for totality is not just bad, and that one has to work in and through that totality, and that within the totality, there's the moment of something beyond and different from the totality. And so his criticisms of Heidegger in particular, but also of Husserl, and also of like the newfangled materialism, I think what he's trying to show is how the failure of Marxism makes it appear as though there's a blind spot in all hitherto bourgeois philosophy, right? And that blind spot is it's the everyday, it's how we live. And so in some sense, you could say kind of tongue-in-cheek, that Heidegger is showing us that Marx wasn't enough of a materialist or something like that. That could be kind of one way of thinking about like the phenomenon of Heidegger, which is really a repetition of the moment of revolutionary bourgeois philosophy. And that this kind of false antinomy of idealism and materialism is the product of the failure of Marxism, the failure of the proletariat to constitute the subject-object of history, the failure of the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat to fulfill the potential of instrumental reason. I mean, another way that's maybe a bit more relatable, because it's not like directly in philosophical terms, that Marcuse uses in One Dimensional Man that I thought reminded me of negative dialectics, and also just might be nice for the audience, is that the status quo seems to favor the pacification of society. And so or history too, that history is going to favor the project that pacifies antagonisms in society, and that pacification can appear as the total domination of instrumental reason via an authoritarian administered state, but it could also look like the dictatorship of the proletariat and the revolution for free humanity, that you could have a critical authoritarianism, right? A critical, dialectical approach and orientation towards instrumental reason. I don't think he's offering an alternative. And also, if he were, I don't think it would make him particularly unique. I think there are lots of people who claim to be offering alternatives to instrumental reason, or to think that we need to find a way out of instrumental reason, not least of whom would be many of the people that Adorno criticizes in negative dialectics.
Did you just offer an argument for the revolution beyond capital?
Yes, in and through instrumental reason, in and through capitalism,
Exactly.
Jay, not against it, not decommodify, not,
I don't know
you know.
I don't know that difference. I literally do not understand what you mean as in and through versus against.
I mean dialectical as opposed to logical.
I literally don't know what you're talking about.
Well, then, I mean, I don't know. I think Lukács would say that you've failed to consider the ABCs of dialectical thinking, Jay. I don't want to say this, but
No, go ahead. Make it clear what the difference is. It's important.
yes, I think it's important. I think that's true.
It's an important mistake, and I'm not following it at all.
Um,
Really, I don't have a clue about what you think the difference is.
Between an alternative to instrumental reason and working, I think that you wouldn't reject instrumental reason.
No one can reject instrumental reason because instrumental reason is one form of reason. No one's rejecting it.
Not that it's merely one form of reason, it's a special.
Yeah, it's now hegemonic. We need alternative forms of reasoning along with it to control it.
Ah, yes, that's the difference. The difference is that I think Adorno and Marxists, and I'm trying to advocate for them on this panel. I will leave to the future to decide whether they're right. Would argue that we cannot, and in fact should not, seek alternative forms of reason that are going to rein in instrumental reason. It's a bit like the analogy would be the desire for the progressive capitalist state to rein in on the economy, to rein in on the excesses of, the economy, the profit motive, etc. The idea being that one must realize the fullest potential of instrumental reason, not try and curb its excesses, that only by...
The excesses are the antithesis.
Yes, and that is the potential for revolution.
That's not potential, that's a just destruction.
And I think that that's where you disagree with Marxism.
I don't recall a word in Marx about the Anthropocene. I don't recall a word in Adorno about it. We're in a new situation. We cannot go back to them and just stay with their vocabulary. We have to reconstruct their vocabulary under new conditions, both political, economic, and technological. To think that we can just repeat those tropes is not to acknowledge the dynamism of history as transformative. We are already inhabiting a perilous new form of life that is already on the edge of capitalism. It's capitalism out of control in a new way, right? What that looks like, I do not know, but I'm certain just repeating the tropes of radicalization as if we knew anything other than, that's why I totally agree. We have very precise tasks. Revolutionary tasks are no longer, so my friend Eva von Redeker has a book forthcoming called Princeton Revolution, or published in German. It's out
in English. Yeah.
It's out in English. I recommend it because she's trying to get you away from the fantasy that revolution is a moment rather than a process. And that revolution is a process that happens interstitially over time and that might congeal in a ruptural insurrectional moment, which we will need in order to accomplish what you say, namely, they are not going to stop drilling just because we want them to, right? So the thought here is there's a series of concrete projects that are now emergent that tell us what a new form of life, and now here's maybe where we differ. I want the people here to survive to 2100 without an utterly diminished quality in their living. unless things change, that will not happen. And to speak of dialectical transformation just seems to me not to engage with the material infrastructure of the world we inhabit.
Are those ideas really that much newer than mine? As in, I think those ideas exist, like there's another Bernstein from the history of the 19th century, and there are other liberals who make exactly those arguments. I just feel as though it is actually a repetition of earlier political moments, and we should ask ourselves what it means. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps all of your ideas are right, but what does it mean that we're repeating political debates from the 19th century? Not just me, I think both of us. Anyway, I don't want to keep speaking too much.
We have to, okay, we'll take one more question. All right, let's take those two last questions. Well, it's, all right, we'll get those last questions in.
I'll try and be brief here. I suppose my primary, not concern, but question from this whole disagreement here is regarding from this kind of centralization, first of the instrumental reason, and secondly from that, the relation to the commodification and the decommodification of land, as Bernstein argues, versus the kind of realization of the potential of the commodification, as you state, Aaron. And I was just hoping perhaps that both of you could potentially clarify, because it seems to me to be that the centrality of your argument, Professor Bernstein, is that essentially the current state of capital and of the political economy in which we exist is dysfunctional and needs to be it needs to be altered to preclude the potential for for the potential of a socialism or what have you. And it seems to me to be, Aaron, that your central argument is that the currently existing forms of capital is in of itself kind of the political precursor to socialism. If you take any disagreement to that kind of formulation, yeah.
Thank you. So Jay earlier quoted from Capital Volume 3 about the absurdity of land ownership being likened to that of owning a slave. And directly following that sentence in that same passage, I quote, "Even a whole society, a nation, or even all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the globe," end quote. So it seems that neither a single ownership nor a collective ownership can be accepted in this vision of a communist future. And this, meaning the abolition of private property, as Marx says in the Paris manuscripts, labor by its very nature is unfree, unhuman, unsocial activity determined by private property and creating private property. Hence, the abolition of private property will become a reality only when it is conceived of as the abolition of labor, end quote. So I wanted to know if any of you can answer this vision of a future in which feasibly the society has only the use and not the ownership of the land, and yet there is an abolition of labor. How do any of you conceive of this? Or is this even necessarily what this future might look like at all? And is that future a utopian one or one that is practically achievable? Thank you.
First of all, thank you all so much for this very spirited discussion. This question is mostly for Professor Bernstein. At the risk of belaboring a question that was asked before, and I know that this is something you touched on in your most recent remarks, Professor Bernstein, but I'm quite compelled by your point that the fault lies not in our inability to imagine a better world, but in our inadequate politics. And I take you to mean that the inadequacy of our current politics is its inability to actualize the alternatives we see in creating a better world. And if I'm right in interpreting your remarks that way, I suppose I wonder how ecofeminism is cashed out into that better world, right? Because it seems like perhaps what was at the heart of the question that was previously asked about this is that it's easy enough to fantasize, right, about the end of mechanized agriculture. But putting the rubber to the road is the question. And how then can ecofeminism create the conditions necessary for actualizing those alternatives? Thank you.
Danny, there's one more in the back.
I just wanted to ask about this concept of decommodification. I wonder if it's not already sort of taking place in some form under imperialism, and how that, whether it's really possible to imagine something like that. For example, at COP26, the focus that was placed by the wealthy nations on coal and the necessity of the countries in the global south to reduce their consumption and production of coal at the expense, of course, of a discussion of oil and natural gas, and whether or not that's really the fate of this kind of piecemeal approach, whether it sort of falls prey to the same. And I think I've said what I wanted to say. Thank you.
And lastly, here with Eli.
Hey, thank you all. I wanted to ask Jay, how progressive do you think the demands of the current environmental movement actually are? Isn't there a sense that environmental arguments can be used to justify the increasing concentration of people in cities and taking more and more away from workers? And how do we stop those arguments from becoming reactionary?
And so in answering those last questions, I want to ask the panelists to join these answers with your final remarks. And so we'll do, again, Jay, Aaron, and John. And so, yeah, thank you.
So I'm not going to be able to answer them adequately, although I'd love to. So the reason I'm pessimistic about capital dynamism is an old motto of the German Greens, namely, capital will cease only when it cuts down the last tree and there's nothing left to eat. That capitalism does not seem to me to have any progressive tendencies toward another form of life. That's always been the German Green analysis, and I share it. Maybe that's where we disagree. I think it is now destructive. I do not agree that we're decommodifying. On the contrary, what we're doing is commodifying more and more of even environmental stuff, commodifying greenhouse gas emissions. Let's do carbon trading. Let's, whenever they say net zero emissions, net doesn't mean zero. It means they're going to trade them off. That's more commodity talk. So I don't see decommodification happening at all as yet. The question about labor really for me is hard and interesting. If you go back and read this text, it actually is their obsession. My own view, and this is my anti-utopia, so I have to be honest, I do not see an end to labor. And the reason I do not see an end to labor is because I think we are talking about a future in which what the environmental community calls adaptation. That is, the fact that we're going to have to over and over again move whole cities, over and over again build new walls, over and over again restructure our societies, is now going to be permanent. I do not see how that's avoidable, that no level of mitigation will not make adaptation to severe weathers a permanent project, even for the most sophisticated societies going forward. So I have the question of what makes labor alienating is working for another. So I would hope that the conditions of labor are not either exploitative nor denying of collective determinations of the labor process, but I don't see an end to labor. I understand stewardship of the earth will continue to be labor. And that partially is the best I can do in answer to Vidya's question. What we know, and I liked what you had to say about how do we get to renewable energies, is we have to imagine a different kind of infrastructure, and therefore different systems of ownership, different systems of responsibility. To say that that is necessary means we know what we need to do. To say that it's a political process means we do not yet know all the details. And that means that the question, and now the question about environment and politics, environmentalism without a consideration of democratic equality can be disastrous. So in their wonderful book, what's it called, the Leviathan book? Climate Leviathan, right? They say, look, there's the Chinese model for dealing with climate change. And so they look at roughly the capitalist model and the Chinese model, and they are pessimistic even more than I am. But unless we have an alternative model to capitalism perfecting itself, which a lot of environmentalism buys into, alas, or, and let's face it, the Chinese model is politically deeply efficient, and the left has not yet bought, right, the notion of radical democratic citizenship. Has lost that thought. So environmentalism, my project itself is one of, right, transformation of nature and transformation of our relations with one another has to be the infrastructure going forward.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. I also won't be able to answer them. I've been trying to reflect on this entire discussion we've had, and I thought, Jay, that your remark that was quoted by one of the people asking a question about how the problem isn't our inability to imagine an alternative, but rather a political problem. I think that's a good insight. It's a good remark. I would, however, say that I think the question of utopia and its meaning is also a political problem. So Leszek Kolakowski, in his essay from the 60s, I forget the exact date, on the concept of the left, called utopia a tool that's produced by capitalism, as in the idea that we have ideas about how things ought to be, which seem impossible, is a tool that is necessary for the left and to some degree defines the left. That must be used and transformed, and that contains within it a moment of negation towards the existing reality. And I think that part of kind of the debates that have happened today, as scattered as they have been, have actually rehearsed debates in a certain way from the history of politics in modern times and from the history of socialism and Marxism and communism, about the relationship of a critical revolutionary politics to liberalism, to progress within capitalism. And I think that the part of the Frankfurt School that I was trying to emphasize, the part of the Frankfurt School which takes up, criticizes, and tries to work through the failures of the left to change reality with its various ideas, utopias, politics, is perhaps, for whatever reason, what is left out in, this idea of how the Frankfurt School can apply to climate politics, that they become a description of the problems in reality that can be fixed in various ways. And what one loses is the ability to engage critically with the failures that the left has faced in these political struggles and that they might face in the future. And I think that that question of why the revolution fails, why the liberal revolution fails, why progress seems to fail, that remains unanswered to this day. And that's why, in general, I thought it was important to bring up the Marxism of the Frankfurt School that threatens to be lost. Anyway, I'll let John speak because I think John deserves a lot of last words.
I guess I'll say something first on this idea of owning the earth. I'm not so familiar with how these debates are playing out within Marxism these days, but I actually just reread Proudhon's text, What is Property? Again, to go back to these 19th century debates. And the main critique of that text is that property gives you the right to destroy something, gives you the right to despoil something. It has to be an unimpeachable, uncurtailed right to do whatever you want with something. And that's basically, the model that we live under. This is the kind of fundamental problem of capitalism. And the alternative to that, he doesn't spell out kind of famously. For that, we need other thinkers, but he calls it communism. So take from that what you will. I'm basically on the side of Jay in terms of thinking of the novelty of the climate crisis. And for me, I'll just throw out two thinkers who I think are doing critical thought that's inspired by Marx in interesting ways. One is Andreas Malm, who's just published a third book on the climate crisis called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And in conjunction with him, doing similar things in the genre of science fiction is Kim Stanley Robinson, who did a PhD under Fred Jameson, the person who basically introduced Adorno in English. And the common thread between their two works, the book is called The Ministry of Future, are the threads of really thinking seriously about what climate terrorism would mean, different forms of disruption, of actually forcing the fossil technologies that we have to become obsolete. And through the building of mass movements, which both of them are, think is essential. There's a kind of vanguardist approach, and there's also a mass movement approach, rooted for both of them in the global south, the people that are going to be most affected by climate catastrophe. So there's, this approach of technology, but also of power. And I think that what they both do is give us really vivid, including through speculative science fiction narratives, scenarios that we might think about for how that transformation could play out. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying that on better days, I'm with Nancy Fraser in that kind of dyad that I laid out, that when we see climate catastrophes happening before us, we need to at least performatively try to use those as opportunities of destabilizing capitalism and, you know, performing social critique by pointing out all the things that we've talked about tonight, about how those contradictions are really fundamental contradictions of our social order, and to take those moments as opportunities for building movements.
I think we've reached the end of the panel. Thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you so much for the audience. Just a reminder that if you are interested and want to learn more or want to be engaged with the Platypus Affiliated Society chapters in New York City, we can find us online. Our website is platypus1917.org, or you can just come to talk to any of us with the Platypus button right now at the end of the panel. We also have a sign-up sheet in front if you want to keep up with our events, and we have a few copies of our publication, the Platypus Review. Can we have another round of applause for our panelists?